Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis, everybody. We're going to explore, I guess you could say, these fascinating connections between creativity and mental illness. And sometimes these connections are a little bit unsettling, right? Have you ever felt like you're just like bursting with these ideas you have?
Yeah.
And you're so excited to share your work, and then you're just met with like indifference or even worse, ridicule. Like, can you imagine that feeling like magnified 1,000 times?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, that was Franz Kafka's reality. Ernst Pawel, in his biography, The Nightmare of Reason, describes how a teenage Kafka wanted to share his writing with his family, and all excited. And he was met with the usual stuff from one of his uncles.
Ouch.
And it really sent him spiraling. He felt completely ostracized.
Wow.
And this really small event for Kafka was a glimpse into this cold space of the world, is how he described it. He felt like he needed to warm it with his writing.
Interesting.
And so today we're going to dive into the life of this literary giant, the man behind the Metamorphosis, the Trial, and the Castle.
Yeah, his work is pretty incredible.
Oh, yeah.
How a single comment can have such a profound impact, but that speaks volumes about Kafka's sensitivity and the immense pressure he felt. And, that was even early on in his life.
Yeah. And it leads us to this question that has been debated for decades. Did Kafka's troubled relationship with his family, especially with his father, did that fuel his genius, or did it just torment him?
It's a tough question. It's complex, but I think by examining his family history, his cultural context, and just his own psychology, his psychological makeup, we can maybe start to figure this out. Paul's biography offers some really great insights into all of this.
Okay, so let's go back to the very beginning. Paul describes this picture of Kafka's family tree. It's kind of, well, not really like a tree, but more like this tangled, thorny vine.
Yeah, definitely not a nice straight oak.
No, not at all. So his paternal grandfather, Jacob, he had a life that was just chock full of restrictions and hardships.
Yeah. He was born in 1814, and he faced all these limitations because of these decrees aimed at controlling the Jewish population. He was barred from getting married.
Really?
And it wasn't uncommon for Jewish men back then. And it's really ironic. He was only allowed to marry because of a revolution that actually that was meant to strengthen the government.
Oh, wow.
But ironically, it ended up giving him more freedom.
Interesting.
It was a really crazy time, a lot of upheaval.
Yeah.
And that sense of precariousness really affected Jewish life during that period.
So it wasn't just like the political climate. It was also that Jacob grew up dirt poor.
Right.
He was working as a kosher butcher from a very young age.
Yeah.
And Paul even mentions how, this is really interesting, the shack where Jacob lived with his 8 siblings outlasted the entire family.
Oh, wow. That's almost poetic in a way.
Yeah.
But Jacob's background is so important because it really shaped his entire worldview. This constant struggle, this feeling of never being secure, never being safe, that was something that he passed on to his kids, especially Herman, who was Kafka's father.
It's like a generational inheritance of hardship, I guess you could say.
Yeah, like that's a good way to put it.
So Herman, he was a tough cookie.
Oh, Herman Kafka was a self-made man. He came from nothing and he became this really successful businessman. But that experience, that struggle to survive, just solidified his cash register mentality. That's how Paul describes it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, like practical to a fault.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine a worse combination for a sensitive artist like Franz. Like, here's this kid who's drawn to literature. He wants to explore the deeper questions of existence. And then, you have his father who's all about bottom lines and tangible success.
Yeah, a total clash of values, really central to understanding their whole dynamic.
Right.
Herman saw art as frivolous, just a waste of time, the exact opposite of practicality.
It's no wonder Kafka felt so misunderstood by his own father.
Yeah, no kidding.
And what about his mother, Julie? Did she offer any solace to him?
Julie Kafka was much quieter, devoted to her husband, but not really equipped to handle the emotional complexities of her son.
Right.
She wasn't harsh like Herman, but her passive nature almost enabled his dismissiveness.
So Franz is caught between his father, who just doesn't understand him, and his mother, who can't really intervene.
Right.
Like, it's a recipe for feeling trapped and unseen. And then to make things even worse, he loses two of his younger brothers.
Oh, yeah, in infancy.
Yeah.
The loss of his brothers definitely added another layer of complexity.
Right.
You know, he was the sole surviving son,
Right.
which intensified the pressure from his father.
Yeah.
It's like everything was working against him to make him feel isolated in his own family.
Oh, man. But wait, there's even more to this, right? Kafka's family tree wasn't just complicated on his father's side.
You got it. His mother's side adds a whole other dimension to this.
Right. His great-uncle Nathan, he was considered, well, mad. And then Nathan's wife, she committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
Kafka actually acknowledged this potential for mental illness that was on his mother's side.
So on one side, you have this legacy of hardship, and then on the other side, you have a potential genetic predisposition to mental illness.
Exactly. It's like, this perfect storm is brewing. But before we jump to any conclusions, we are talking about Franz Kafka here.
Yeah.
A one-of-a-kind mind.
Yeah, but it's clear the foundation was, we'll say, a little shaky.
To say the least. To really understand how all of this affected Kafka, we need to look outside the family, out into the world he was born into.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Prague in the late 19th and early 20th century, I mean, it wasn't exactly peaceful, was it?
No. Prague back then, it was this mix of so many cultures and ethnicities, but it was also just this cauldron of political and social tension. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was crumbling, Nationalism was on the rise. Anti-Semitism was becoming more and more of a problem. That doesn't sound like a great recipe for inner peace.
Not at all. And for Kafka, he was a German-speaking Jew living in Prague, so his identity was already really complex.
Yeah.
And he didn't fully belong to either the Czech or the German communities. And he was really aware of the growing hostility towards Jews. Imagine always feeling like you're on the outside looking in.
It's like he was born into this world of contradictions and tensions, and that's all before we even get to his own internal struggles.
Yeah, exactly. And this feeling of being an outsider, of being stuck in a world that doesn't understand you, that's something you see come up again and again in his work.
Yeah.
And to understand how this feeling shows up in his writing, we have to look at Kafka's education.
Okay.
Where he first ran into, these absurd and oppressive authority figures that would later populate, all of his stories.
Okay, let's talk about school.
Yeah.
I don't think this is going to be a, best years of your life type of story.
Definitely not. Kafka's early education was this weird mix of super strict discipline, cultural alienation, and these little glimmers of intellectual awakening. Remember that whole feeling of being an outsider. Kafka's early education really made that even worse.
Oh, it just sounds like a recipe for an identity crisis.
Yeah.
Being Jewish in a German school in a Czech city.
Exactly. These German Jewish schools were seen as like these symbols of German culture. But most of the students were Jewish, just like Kafka.
Oh, wow.
And so this made them a target for Czech nationalists, It created this really unsettling atmosphere.
Yeah.
Like he was stuck between a rock and a hard place.
So not only is he dealing with this feeling of alienation within his family, but now he's got this cultural and political tension, too. It's like isolating him even more.
Exactly. And on top of all of that, his experiences with authority figures really didn't help. Paul tells this story about Kafka being dragged to school every single morning by the family cook.
Really?
She would literally threaten to tell the teacher about his naughtiness. I know it sounds funny, but it gives you this really clear picture of Kafka's early experiences with power and control.
It's like he was constantly being reminded that he didn't have any power.
Right, and that probably didn't help him feel good about himself.
Yeah, and these experiences with authority figures didn't stop at home.
You got it. They continued inside the school, too. There was one teacher in particular, Brother Gishvind. He was a classicist known for being super strict and totally unpredictable.
Ugh, I know that type.
Yeah.
The kind of teacher who could make or break your day depending on their mood.
Exactly. Brother Gishvind represents this kind of arbitrary and cruel power that Kafka would later write about. His characters are always stuck in these crazy and nightmarish situations, completely at the mercy of these faceless bureaucratic forces.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's like all of these experiences, from his father to his teachers, were planting the seeds for the things that would obsess him in his writing.
I think you're right. But it wasn't just these oppressive figures that shaped Kafka. His friendships were important too, especially his friendship with Hugo Bergman.
Hugo Bergman, his best friend from school. Wasn't he like a genius?
He was. He was brilliant, especially at math, which was a subject that Kafka really struggled with. Imagine constantly being compared to your best friend, who's amazing at everything you're bad at, especially when your father values those things that you're bad at.
It sounds really frustrating.
It was. And Kafka already felt inadequate. This feeling, combined with all of the anti-Semitism at the time, created this sense of unease and vulnerability that you can really feel in his writing.
We've talked about the political and cultural tension in Prague, but do you have any examples of how that anti-Semitism actually affected Kafka?
Well, a good example is the Hilsner affair. It happened when Kafka was a teenager. It was a blood libel case, like the Dreyfus affair in France. A Jewish man was falsely accused of murdering a Christian girl.
Those blood libel cases were so scary.
Yeah.
Talk about being targeted for your religion.
It really shows the prejudice that existed in Europe at that time. Jews were often blamed for society's problems, and this case shows how easily these fears could be used to justify violence.
For Kafka, who was already struggling with feelings of alienation and uncertainty, the Hilsner affair must have been really upsetting.
Definitely. It confirmed his fears about what it meant to be Jewish in a society where anti-Semitism was becoming normal. You can see how this experience might have influenced his writing. His characters are often falsely accused and persecuted by systems that are absurd and unjust.
Like his own anxieties about the world were coming out in his stories.
Exactly. But even with all of this darkness and uncertainty, Kafka did find some comfort and connection. His friendships were super important. They gave him a sense of belonging and intellectual stimulation that he didn't really find anywhere else.
We mentioned Max Brod, who later became Kafka's literary executor.
Yeah.
But he had other friends too, right?
Yes, he was friends with Oscar Baum. He was a blind philosopher, and Kafka really admired his resilience. And then there was Felix Welch. He was known for being super smart. These friends gave Kafka a sense of community, a place where he could talk about ideas and share his writing without being judged.
Do you think his writing would have even survived without those friends?
It's possible, but beyond just supporting him, his friends helped shape Kafka intellectually and artistically. They would have these big debates about literature, philosophy, and the world around them.
So they weren't just hanging out. They were getting into some pretty deep stuff.
Oh, yeah. And through these discussions, we can start to understand how Kafka developed his unique view of the world, the view that would later show up in his incredible and sometimes really disturbing stories.
It sounds like Kafka was always looking for something, meaning connection, a way to understand a world that often felt hostile and absurd.
That's exactly it. That search, that yearning, it's at the heart of all of Kafka's work. And I think that's why people still connect with his writing today. We all struggle with feelings of alienation, uncertainty, and wanting to find our place in the world.
Kafka's struggles, in a way, reflect our own struggles. But where do we go from here? We've looked at his family, his cultural context, his education, his friendships. What's the next layer to this whole Kafka thing?
To really understand Kafka, we have to look at his creative process. We have to look at the themes that he was obsessed with, the things that he was anxious about, and the ways that he used language to create his unique and unsettling world.
Okay, everybody, buckle up. We're about to go deep into the mind of Franz Kafka. Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. We're really going deep into Kafka here, exploring his life and work. He's extraordinary, but he's also kind of enigmatic, right? So far, we've seen how, his family, the culture he lived in, his education, all of that contributed to his sense of alienation and his fascination with, feeling powerless and absurdity. But I'm curious, how did all these influences actually show up in his writing?
That's a great question. I think the key is understanding how Kafka approached creativity. He wasn't just trying to tell stories, he was wrestling with his own anxieties, his own internal demons, and he was using writing as a way to work through these complex emotions.
So it's almost like writing wasn't just a job for him. It was more like therapy.
Yeah, I think so.
Trying to make sense of a world that felt chaotic.
Exactly.
And you can really see this therapeutic aspect of his writing in the themes that keep popping up in his stories. Alienation, guilt, the search for meaning, fighting against these oppressive forces. These weren't just abstract ideas for Kafka. They were things he experienced and then put on the page.
Right.
So it's like we're getting this glimpse into his soul when we read his work.
I think so. But it's not just about understanding Kafka the man, it's also about understanding how his struggles, his anxieties, that search for meaning, those are things that resonate with people even today.
Yeah. It's like he's tapping into something that's universal, right? That feeling of being lost or caught in these systems we can't control, and then just wanting to feel connected when everything feels so isolating.
Exactly. And that's why I think Kafka's still relevant. His work speaks to our own anxieties about modern life, about these bureaucratic structures that can feel so suffocating.
Right.
And about trying to figure out who we are in this world that's always changing.
So we've got these universal themes and all this personal anxiety that's fueling his writing. But what about his style, How did he take these really complicated ideas and make them into such compelling stories?
Kafka was a master at creating a very specific mood in his writing. He used these dreamlike images, absurd situations, and then this kind of creeping feeling of dread to pull the reader into his world.
That's why reading Kafka can feel like you're in a nightmare, right? It's
Yeah.
so unsettling, but you can't look away.
Yeah, exactly. Think about the metamorphosis. It starts with this guy, Gregor Samsa, who wakes up as a giant insect.
Yeah.
It's bizarre, it's unsettling, and it instantly throws you into this world of absurdity and alienation. And then as the story goes on, the feeling of unease just gets worse.
It's funny, we're talking about a guy who turns into a bug, but it somehow feels so real. Like it taps into that fear we all have of being an outcast or becoming something monstrous, something that people we love won't even recognize.
That's what Kafka does so well. He takes these crazy situations and uses them to explore these deep truths about what it means to be human. It's not really about the bug, it's about being isolated, about not being able to communicate. It's about being trapped.
Right.
And that theme of feeling trapped, of being caught in these systems that are absurd and oppressive, it's everywhere in his work.
It is, like in the trial, right? Joseph K. gets arrested and put on trial for a crime that they never even tell him.
Exactly.
He's stuck in this confusing legal system, and the rules keep changing. Nobody has any answers.
Right.
It would make you paranoid, that feeling that someone is accusing you, judging you, but you don't even know what you did.
And that's Kafka's brilliance. He takes those everyday anxieties and he turns them up, twists them, distorts them until they become these nightmarish worlds that we can't help but be pulled into.
Yeah, it's like he's holding a mirror up to our fears, our anxieties.
Mhm.
He's making us confront this dark side of humanity and these often absurd structures that control our lives.
And I think that's why we're still so fascinated by his work.
Yeah.
Despite how bleak it is, how much anxiety it creates. It's a challenge. It's a reminder that the world can be a very strange and unsettling place.
So, after all of this, exploring his life, his struggles, his writing, what's the takeaway? What's the final thought?
I think the most important takeaway is that Kafka's brilliance didn't just come from his suffering. It came from how he took that pain and turned it into these metaphors, metaphors that speak to all of us.
Right.
He reminds us that even when things are really bad, even when things don't make sense, we can still find ways to express ourselves, to connect with other people,
Yeah.
and to create something beautiful.
That's a great point. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Franz Kafka. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep embracing the complexity of being human.